Thank you. Well, thank you for coming out through the hail and everything else today. So I have a lot to cover, and actually for us to actually try out a case study today. So we will, of course, do active learning in our own session about active learning today. So it won't just be me talking. And I'm very happy to take questions as we go, because it's really a conversation, right? So all of us in here are teachers, and so whether or not you've tried this before, it's a conversation for us to really work out. So I have a bunch of handouts that I can also send out as links after that are really focused on helping teachers think about how they might put this into their classroom. So yes, I did want to mention briefly, right, so I think I have the best job in the world. So I'm split half in the College of Liberal Arts and half in the College of Science. So all of the things that I work on in particular are somehow related to environment, but I basically do half environmental science and half environmental humanities. The case studies approach is not specific to one field, so whatever field that you work in, I'm going to share a lot of examples from my classrooms that are related to the environment, but this is applicable for all kinds of approaches. And we'll talk about which fields were actually the origin for this approach, and it was not environmental science or studies at all. So I'll give some examples from my class. I actively do this in all of my classes, right? So one particular source of inspiration when it comes to thinking about this approach in the College of Science is that when RIT switched from the quarter schedule to the semester schedule, some classes actually lost labs, right? And here at RIT, we love experiential learning. And so if I teach a class that's in the basement of a building with no windows, and I'm trying to engage students about something outside, it's a real challenge in a lecture, traditional lecture setting, right? So think about case studies as one way to really bring the world to your students in a lecture hall format, right? So one of the classes that I teach here at RIT is conservation biology, and we are often in a windowless basement, right? And that was one of those classes that lost its lab in that transition. So right now it's a lecture-only format. So how are we going to talk about large game conservation in places my students have never been, and how people make those decisions? This is one way to think about really bringing those experiences to students. We'll talk some more about reasons why this might fit for topics you're covering. We're going to talk about places you can find existing case studies, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to do a ton of work. There's a lot that's already out there. So we're going to cover a lot of resources that already exist that you can immediately tap into. But as we talk about this, I'm sure you're going to think to yourself, I already do that in class, and I have some things that probably count as a case study. And so as teacher scholars, right, we're often looking for ways to be in dialogue with our peers, and you can actually publish your own case studies that you develop in peer-reviewed journals, right? So it's not just a place to get information from other people developing them, but actually a way that you can do more scholarship. And so I'll share some examples from actually working with graduate students last semester who wrote one. And I'm teaching a freshman class this semester, and they're writing their own case studies for publication. So it's really possible at all levels to think about applying this, not only in the use of, but the creation of, as a way to think about engaging students in project-based learning. All right, so if you haven't heard the term, you've heard the term, like, what the heck are case studies? And so the wonky version, right, is that it's descriptive qualitative research. You don't have to be doing research to use a case study, though. You can really just think of it as a story, right? So stories are actually a really hot topic right now, especially in the sciences, thinking about how can we use story and narrative to engage people instead of just showing them traditional journal article formats, right? Instead of just having them passively read something, what are the ways that we can use different approaches that are actually focused on student learning, right? So if we just present them information, if I stand up here and just lecture at them, how can we think about different ways to get the information where they're going to retain it for longer? So there's some excellent quotes that try to define this in a lot more words. This is half of one of them. The vehicle by which a chunk of reality is brought into the classroom to be worked over by the class and the instructor. So you're trying to take the real world, messy and complicated, and this is a tiny piece of it, right? So one of the things we're going to keep talking about is that case studies are not everything. It's a piece of something. And the idea being that a good case keeps the class discussion grounded upon some of the stubborn facts that must be faced in real life situations. So this is one of the key parts about case studies, is that even if you're talking about theory or having them read about theory, it's trying to have them apply their knowledge that you're talking about. So case studies are perfect for active learning, where we're trying to think about how can we get students to retain their knowledge that we're presenting to them by having to try it out, to test it, right? And this is great for thinking about flipped classrooms, because you might assign the reading as the homework, but they come to class, and what are you going to do with them to have them try to use that knowledge they read about or watched your recorded lecture, right? So this is one way to think about doing that. So you might be thinking, my husband was saying this to me, so what the heck is a case study though? Like, so it's an example. But so it's a little bit different. So I want to walk through why it's not the same as just an anecdote, right? So I could give you an anecdote that explains a concept in conservation biology. The difference though between it being an anecdote or an example in a lecture and it being a case study is that if it's an example in a lecture, I'm still telling you the whole story. A case study has the students work through the whole story. We're going to talk about what some of those elements are. So how do you actually do that? So you basically turn it on to the students. That's why it's active. So instead of me explaining a story about conserving elephants in a foreign country, we turn it into an activity that happens in class where students often take on roles of other people. So we're going to talk about what that might look like. It doesn't always involve role playing, but that's one of the ways case studies often get students to get outside of their own head and embody some other ideas. So that's the real difference between just saying, well, of course I use examples in my lectures, and behind thinking about what it might look like to actually switch to a case study based approach. All right, so why did people start doing this? You might be in one of these fields or a totally different field. Case studies are the way that business school, law school, and often medical school now actually teach their graduate students to become practitioners. So often case studies are about pretending to be the practitioner, getting to wear your practitioner hat, right? So for example, in my conservation class, they might get to try out being a land manager. But if you try this more than once, right, if this is for half an hour and then we try it again next week, students actually switch the roles that they're playing, right? So they get to be a lot of different kinds of person. And what roles those are might really vary by field, but that's one of the approaches. So for example, I checked this out this week. Harvard Business School, they're one of the real pioneers of this approach and saying this is the way that we teach our graduate students. It's now often a standard approach in terms of actually thinking about management or government. So there's lots of different fields now that are fully switching their graduate training to case studies. So when I was looking at Harvard Business School's website this week, they actually brag as a recruiting tool that by the time you get out of our program, you will have learned 500 cases. So they have entirely flipped their training to only being cases. So you don't have to do that for your classes, right? You could just try out one and see how it goes, right? But there's an idea that this has been done for a long time. So in the 50s was when Harvard fully switched to doing all business education is done only by case studies. It is the approach that's used. So really a lot of fields are catching up to that in terms of thinking about how could we potentially use this in biology? How could we use this approach in our PA program, for example, right? So really there are people in every discipline that are using case studies, even if it's not the standard approach in your field right now. So I didn't know who was going to show up, but we can look at examples from anybody's field, right? And we're going to look at a couple today, but we can think about where you might find discipline-specific resources for whatever field that you're in where you want to think about doing this. So even if you're not in the business school, right, why should you think about doing this? So Buffalo, and we'll talk more about Buffalo Center on Case Study Education, they have a lot of resources that could be useful to you, but they've actually done NSF-sponsored research on what kinds of outcomes we get for using case study-based approaches in the classroom. And they've actually found that attendance and attitude about class increase when you use case studies in class, right? They're not sitting there passively listening to a lecture. They're actually getting to do activities in class where they try on different hats. And students actually report that they like going to class more, and they actually are more likely to show up to class when that happens. We're going to talk about this in terms of thinking of ourselves as teachers, or whether or not that's a strength or a weakness, but you cover less material, right? So we're going to talk about what that means, but they actually retain more information from using a case study approach than by using a lecture-based format. So if we're not just interested in covering a range of topics, but actually wanting our students to hold on to that information, case studies are a way from the practice applying it, and they're more likely to keep that information for longer. And a lot of us use group work, but this can help give you a scaffold for structuring that, right? So when I do group work in class, if students are working in small groups, and we're going to do a case study today amongst ourselves as a small group, you can't be everywhere in the room at once, right? So using a formal case study approach can help structure small group activities so that students are staying on task and they have an end goal in mind. So often one of the pieces of the formal case study approach is a set of discussion questions, but it's not just discussion questions, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like when we can actually walk through one of them.
Say something about slides.
Oh, that you will get all of these slides. You don't have to take all the notes unless you want to. Yeah. And this is a great quote that the Buffalo Center really likes to say. And their argument is because wisdom can't be told, right? So the idea behind the case study approach is that when students get to practice using this information, they're going to retain it for longer. And basically all the learning outcomes that we want as teachers are going to be improved by them not just listening to it, right? So that's really fundamental to any kind of active learning approach. But case studies are one way to get there. All right, so some of the strengths, and we'll go through examples again, but to think about conceptually is that it's really focused on flexibility. So with a case study approach, there's not one answer that you're going to know that all of your student teams necessarily get to. So for some teachers, that might be hard to think through in terms of, well, I know I want them to cover this content, but often case study approaches let students take ownership of where the conversation goes. This can be a great thing, right? They might actually apply concepts that you didn't even intend to be part of the conversation. So that flexibility can actually help make deeper level discussions in small groups. The other is this emphasis on context. So everybody's field has theory in it, but one of the challenges when our students go from being students to practitioners in whatever field they're going into is they have to deal with messy situations. And often case studies, some of them are hypothetical. We're going to use a hypothetical one today. But often people write them about real world scenarios. And the whole point is for people to think about how complicated it is to make the decision in real time as a practitioner. We're also, as teachers here today, going to talk about that as a potential weakness. Because one of the challenges, depending on what field you're in, is thinking about whether or not context is okay to address explicitly, right? So sometimes in the sciences, for example, we'd like to say, well, we're objective. So what does the context piece have to do with this, right? But medicine is a great example of people who want to be objective, hard science-based practitioners having to think a lot about context. So case studies are often used to teach students to become diagnosticians, right? So there's a set of symptoms, but they show up differently in different people, right? So context is really important. I can give you a great example actually from feminist biology, which is thinking about how symptoms show up differently in men and women. So it used to be, for example, that human health research in the US was only done on men as a default. And so, for example, heart attack symptoms show up differently depending on your gender. And so if you don't think about context, right, you might misdiagnose somebody. So there's lots of great reasons, even if you're not in a social science or the humanities, to think about how context is really important when it comes to whatever field you're training your students in. All right, and so for any of the skeptics, maybe you're not a skeptic if you already came to have this discussion, right? But you could be saying, I don't really know how this is going to work in my class. And we have a lot of material to cover, right? So often if I'm teaching an upper level class, I may not be as worried about, are we going to cover X amount of textbook content because they really needed to go on to that next class. But this can be this point of tension about thinking about the investment of time that has to go into doing a case study versus covering some other amount of material. So one of the points that more broadly people like to talk about this when it comes to active learning is to think about, do you really have to cover all of that material? So I think this is a point of conversation for all of us as teachers to think about, what do I need to cover? But if I want to make sure that they remember all the information we're covering, can I invest in those higher investment activities where we're going to spend a whole class period doing an activity where they get to apply their knowledge? So one way to think about this is, can you make activities that integrate multiple weeks of information, right? So case studies can really vary in scope. You don't have to do them every class period. So if you throw them in occasionally, you don't necessarily have to worry about, well, I don't want to flip my whole classroom, right? Or I don't want to lose half an hour every week to this kind of activity. There are ways to think about how you might do this at the end of a unit, for example, where they apply all their knowledge from the unit, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about how you might scope this and still cover all the things that you need to in your course. The other, which we partly just addressed, right, is thinking about how does subjectivity play into your field? So that might really vary by whatever discipline you're in. But case studies, right, if you have to take on the role of somebody else, it's all about thinking about those areas of subjectivity, right, where there may not be a clear answer. But for so much of what we teach our students, regardless of what field they're in, we want them to come out with critical thinking skills, right? Case studies are a great way for them to sort of sit with messy things and try to make hard decisions. So when we think about the broader goals of what we're training them for as students leaving the university, case studies are a great way to try to apply these critical thinking skills. So there was a great study that was done in 2006 by a social studies researcher that was 5 misunderstandings about case studies. So we're going to go through what the 5 sort of myths about case studies are, and then we're actually going to do a short case study in small groups together, right? Because I think it's also great for us to think about why these might not work and then sort of break them down and think about overcoming them. So I have a document actually for all of us, and I love this. So Harvard actually said, here's some challenges, and we already have solutions in mind for you, right? So this is great for all of us as teachers when we're preparing to think about doing one, that we can potentially anticipate some of the common either feedback, pushback you might get from students about being like, why do I have to do this? Or thinking about how you might integrate into your classroom, right? So we can walk through this. All right, so thinking about the myths in general. So one of them is the idea that if we present to them general information, if we give them universal rules in the sciences or whatever field you're in, that that's more valuable than having concrete and practical knowledge that's context dependent, right? So their argument was that this is really a misunderstanding. It's really important for students to have both. And so case studies are not the absence of theory. They're often a way to apply theory. So these don't have to be opposites. You can think of case studies as a way to ask students to apply what you're teaching them. And so what good is it for them to have generalized theory if they can't apply it, right? So think of this as a way to do that in sort of a practice scenario, right? You're letting them be in a low stakes pretend situation to apply that information and not a high stakes testing one. All right, so the next one is the argument, he's claiming it's a myth, right, that you can't generalize on the basis of an individual case, ergo you shouldn't do them at all. So this is one of the points of pushback, basically, that people get on using the case study method. But there are a lot of valuable reasons to walk through one case. So the argument is that by looking really closely at one story, we can go really in depth on that story. So I'll give you an example again from conservation biology. We covered the Endangered Species Act and talking about endangered species management. So one of the case studies that we do in class is taking a profile of one particular animal that's on the endangered species list, and the students are in teams where they pretend to be the God Squad. If you've never heard of the God Squad, it's basically all the cabinet ministers, the equivalent in the US, and they get an up-down vote on whether or not to exempt a species that's supposed to be endangered from protection based on economic concerns. So the students have basically a backstory for themselves. One has to be the Secretary of the Army, right? So they're each playing a different role, and then they actually have to vote based on the information that they have about their particular organism. So they have to end up reaching a decision, and they represent a worldview, right? So it's not just about applying the general information they have in class, but they can walk through that one case, that one particular, bumblebee that they're working on, and think about what that might look like for any other organism that's going to do this, right? So it's going in depth on one small story as a way to explore much broader issues. So the myth is that it's great for generating hypotheses as the first step, but other methods would be better for actually testing them and building theory. So this one is more specific to if you want to use this approach to actually doing research. So when we talk about what it looks like to actually write your own case study, this one is more about saying, well, that's great that you use case studies in class, right? But that's not real research. So case studies actually are real research, right? This is qualitative research. So even quantitative fields can benefit from having qualitative stories as a way to explore what's happening in that field, right? So you can think of these as individual stories, but there's still value to quantitative and qualitative arguments together, right? So one way to think about this when it comes to building them with yourselves or your students is, why would you ask your students to do this as an activity? So for example, in the class I'm teaching this semester, I have first-year students, none of whom are environmental science or studies majors, all writing case studies in semester group projects. So there are some reasons to think about why they might actually be able to do case study research when they are not yet experts in that field and maybe never going to be experts in that field. One, and we'll look through some other examples, is that case studies often don't have a lot of jargon. So people can tell a story in a more relatable way without having to know or be fluent in all the jargon of the field, right? The whole point is to be able to do this with other people. And so it's a very different kind of writing and sharing of story than writing a peer-reviewed full journal article. They're very concise. So for example, the ones that my students are writing this semester are 1,500 words, that's it. That doesn't mean that less work goes into them than writing a 10-page paper for my class. It's a different kind of output that they're doing. But it can also be usable to more people. So the motivation for doing this kind of research and who you might engage and who the audience is can often be motivating to different students than the ones who maybe want to write a full research article. All right, so one of the challenges to think about is that it has a bias towards verification, right? So what I tell you in my story, I'm obviously going to only tell you an example that proves the theory point I wanted to start with, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about how you might fight this. So how do you not just share a case study that's going to just confirm what people already thought at the beginning of it? So when it comes to developing your own case studies, that's one of the reasons there are actually entire peer-reviewed journals of case study, is to basically get feedback from other people about whether or not your case study is doing this. And the other is because a lot of them can actually end with, instead of a firm conclusion, they often end with a list of discussion questions. So one way to fight this is to make sure that the whole point is to have a particular conversation and not necessarily get to a particular end product. So those are two ways to think about fighting that particular myth. And the last one is that it can often be difficult to summarize and develop propositions and theories just based on specifics. So the arguments against this are many, but one of which is that basically all stories add up to become data, right? So case studies are maybe anecdata in that sense, right? But what is data other than made up of many, many stories, right? So yes, they are valid arguments that can become part of broader theories. It doesn't mean necessarily you should make universal rules from individual case studies, but often in part because they are based on real world events that happen. They literally took place, right? So they are a part of the world. They are data points in and of themselves, even if they're not universal theories. So they're data points, right? So all of that means that we can contextualize how we teach them and not just say this one story means everything has to be true in the world because of this one story. But that doesn't mean there aren't ways to appropriately use them to illustrate points and have conversations in class. So these are the extreme arguments against using them, right? For us to think about, well, maybe there are ways that I can use them that would be appropriate to teach particular points or explore particular conversations in my class. Yep.
What's the citation for what's it for? Is it an article on?
It is an article, yep. So I think it's in Inquiry, but I can send that out when we send out the slides, the link to this. So it's 5 misunderstandings about case studies. So now we're going to try one out. So I brought a really short one. We're going to talk about where you might be able to find them. So I brought 2 things, one of which is if you were to use this in your class, this piece would be the only thing the students see. This would be the notes that you would see as the instructor. So I want you to have both, and so I purposely printed them on separate pieces of paper. So these are the kinds of case studies that if you're like, great, I'm interested in trying this out, but I don't want to devote yet a lot of time to thinking about this, you might want to start by looking through existing case studies that are already out there in the world, that have already been classroom tested at the age or grade or topic level that you're interested in working in. So I will first, if I can give you this to pass around. This is the teacher notes. So this is from the National Center on Case Study Teaching in Science. That's based out of Buffalo. So they have a free database online. I pulled up the website, we can look at it. They're not the only repository, and they define science very broadly. It also includes social science. And these repositories are peer-reviewed, and they're classroom tested. There are other smaller repositories that are often topic-based. So if you're saying, okay, I teach electrical engineering, there are case studies that are specific to that, right? A lot of them are based in industry. So for example, there are entire databases that are specific to business or management or government, but pretty much any topic you can think of, we can help you find a repository of existing ones. When we talk about where you might publish them, those are often some of the same places that you might choose to send in a case study. So for example, you can see at the top of your notes, this was written by a faculty member at a particular college. So a faculty member wrote this. And so what I'm going to hand out is the page that your students would see if you just straight up printed the case study and gave it to them. The other things for you to think about as an instructor is that maybe you want to adapt the materials of the case study, right? So there's nothing preventing you. A bunch of these basically say that you're welcome to download them and adapt them to your own use. So if you decide you only want to do one question or you want to write your own questions, you're welcome to modify these. So these are often designed to be done in small groups. I brought a very different example of one. This is a very short one because we have an hour today to talk about a lot of things. This is one from a different repository that's from SYSYNC, which is a National Synthesis Center for Socioeconomic Research that's focused on the environment, that's based out of Annapolis in Maryland. The background material just for the instructor for this is 25 pages long. So there are wide variety, and a lot of the ones, these have also been classroom tested at university levels, but they might be, here's a week's worth of activities. So this one is really short that all of you are getting. This could be done in one class period if you had 50 minutes. Others of them might require that you assign 3 hours worth of videos for homework, right? So there's a lot to think about in terms of how you want to bring them into your classroom and what they might look like. So you can scale them to your interests and needs for your classroom. So good published case studies will give you estimates for how long it will take to do in class. So this repository, for example, will say, okay, this was classroom tested and it worked in 2 sessions of a 90-minute class, for example, right? So you might then flip through and decide, well, I have a 50-minute class, so I need to modify this for myself, right? So you don't have to only do it as it's taught, especially if your class doesn't work that way. So I can pass this one around so you can see a very different example. So my challenge to you then is to actually try it out. So read through the one-page case study example. So think about that if you were the student, this would be the only information that you received about it in class, right? So after you read it all, then talk to the person next to you, right? Actually work through the discussion questions. A lot of these that are longer and more involved, if it was for 6 people, might actually give you the background page-long reading for you to play your role, right? So I mentioned my example of the God Squad, and it would actually then say, okay, you're the Secretary of the Army, here's all the information you need to know to play that role in your small group, right? When we think about why students might want to do this, it can often be less intimidating for them to present to that small group of people than to get up in front of the whole class and pretend to be the Secretary of the Army, right? And they have that reading in front of them to refer back to as they have those discussion questions. I'll let Michael be my partner. I said, I'll be your partner for the. So hopefully everybody has one. So read through it. Yes, yep.
I don't mind sharing.
Oh. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, so if you're going to do this in class, this one doesn't specify, but you might get assigned a partner, or maybe you'd say, okay, you're at a table of 3. So one thing for you to think about in terms of how it might work in your room is this depends on the activity and how it's set up. But if you modified it, you might say, you know, this one's pretty short. You could just talk to a partner, right? This one, I purposely brought a short one for our time today, but these can get really involved and involve different sized teams of students working together. Yeah.
I leaned in your direction.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, this one here is related to a class that has this background.
Yes, right. So this is the paper that you would have received if you were the instructor, and if it matched what your learning objectives were, this might make sense to cover. Right, so if these weren't the things you were learning about in class, students might not have the background information they would need to answer these questions. But one of the goals is to, if you're covering basically things related to blood, vegetables, and bacterial infection, this is one way to actually give them a real world situation. This one is hypothetical, right? It's an imaginary person, but you can give them a way to walk through applying what they might have just read in a textbook for your class, for example. So one of the reasons that these notes exist for teachers is that you then can figure out whether it matches the learning objectives for your class if you want to use it. So yes, if your class hadn't covered those things, this might be a really poor match to using in your classroom, right?
I've used the Harvard business ones before, not in quite a while. I've done some case research. It may not work with what you have planned today, but I'm very interested in learning how you've used it as an assignment in class in terms of developing.
Yes, yeah. So I can tell you that one of the motivations, especially for graduate students, to do it is that they can publish them. So last semester, I teach a class that has graduate students co-enrolled, and they have an additional requirement. And so last year, I said, okay, you four will actually write a case study. You can pick the topics. They also love that because they are picking a particular case. So the 4 graduate students figured out what their shared interest was, and then they did all the research for it. And then the lucky thing for them about it being a co-enrolled class was they actually piloted it in class, and then they revised it based on their experience and wrote their teaching notes for it based on what it was like to have actually led it in the classroom.
So they're obviously producing a teaching case.
Yes. Yep. Right, and so it can work well for something like that. The students in my freshman class this semester are writing research-based ones that are not necessarily teaching ones. So Case Studies on the Environment is a research journal that only publishes environmental-related ones. So the class I'm teaching, they're all science and engineering majors who have to take a humanities class. So they're actually having to do original research outside of their discipline as non-majors, and the case makes it focused enough that they can do it together. So yeah, I will talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but the case approach makes it basically manageable. It's so narrow that they can actually dive into it. And for students who are really new to research, it actually makes searching for information much easier because they're not wading through a lot of information.
Now those research cases that they're doing in that class, are they primarily collecting secondary data to build?
Yes, for them. Some of them did have interest actually in going through IRB and wanting to do it. That works better, I find, with year-long classes because we got to get them to do the IRB training if they want to do a survey. One group is interested in doing literature and the environment, and so they actually wanted to poll, people on campus. But then they were trying to work through whether or not they had the time to do the survey and analyze it. So yes, a lot of them are in practice doing what we would call like literature research in the sense of compiling and reorganizing and reanalyzing other people's information. Yep.
So if I were doing this in class, as a student, I would need my computer to look up these terms, right?
Or you'd already have covered them, right? So I definitely do not teach this kind of biology, but the idea would be that if you covered these things in class already, right, if I knew what these were, then I could walk through this case. So this one is a really short one and really straightforward in the sense that it's really just a way of making discussion questions that are not just saying, go talk about chemotaxis. You're like, what are they going to talk about, right? So when we think about how do we use them in part as a way to scaffold group discussion in class and keep them on task, and knowing then that, okay, if we covered all of this, you might circle back and have them report out or not. Maybe they make notes to themselves. Then you're also going to know that they covered all these things in their group work in class. It might become fair game for thinking about applying it on the test, right? So those might be ways of thinking about, well, we did that in class where they had to apply that concept. Now I could give them another hypothetical where they apply it in a different way, right? Almost like, it's almost like word problems, right? If we think about math or science. So we're often asking them to think about taking their knowledge to the next step. Yeah, but yes, I agree that this one would only work if we'd already covered those concepts.
Right, so it follows a lecture on
Yes,
this topic.
yes. Yeah, so it doesn't replace it. So that's why I was mentioning it might work if you say you're going to go read your textbook chapter that covers these things, then this becomes part of what you do in class. And then if students end up struggling with those things and can't apply them, that's also a good self-test for them, right? To think about, okay, I read that, but I wasn't able to apply it here. So I might have to think about what that means. Is that they skimmed it, right? Is that they didn't understand the concept? So when we ask them to apply that information, we can often find out where they might be stuck.
How would you personally, in the case of, let's forget about the actual content,
Yeah.
let's just say it's specific to your discipline, how might you avoid the issue in class of using this case where, okay, you do question 2, you do question 1, I do question 3, and let's work on this, and then at the end of the class.
Yeah, so
how would you-
I think we'll talk about that in a big group too, but I often modify all of it. So I might give them this first, and I might roll out one question at a time,
Okay.
so that they're all talking about it together one step at a time. So often if I teach one that's from this center, it might all be on nice printable one sheet of paper, but I don't want them to read ahead necessarily, right? So especially if it's a multi-part activity where it's going, then do this other thing, some of them might not just be answering, it might be, I often have students draw things as a way to apply knowledge, right? So that's another way where if I don't want to just give them this printout, maybe I just want to give them the background, and then I'm going to give them my own question, or just one question, right? There's these ways to modify it or modify the output that you can control and better scaffold it. Yes, because I definitely worry about that in class where I'm trying to make sure that we're on topic, right? And then they're not just doing one-word answers.
We're doing some active learning.
Yeah.
So maybe briefly explaining what you just
Yes,
told.
yes.
Okay.
All right, so wrap up your conversation with your neighbor, and I'm hearing some interesting things that we can then circle back with everybody to discuss. Oh. Oh, you're welcome. Ooh. Okay, so like 10 seconds left, and then we'll talk with everybody. All right, so I want to make sure that we have time to cover some strategies. So I'll just, so especially if you're new to this, what did you think about this? So I will again caveat, none of us in this room might actually teach any of these topics, right? So this might not be a very one that's useful to your particular class. It's not useful to my particular classes in particular. Just a short exercise for us to see how this might work. So this is an extreme version of a short one, right? So I passed around, there's much, much longer and more detailed ones with really active roles you might play. And this one is just being yourself, having a conversation maybe with a neighbor. We were having a conversation on the side about thinking about how this might work, right? So you have, as a teacher, you have access to these sort of structuring notes. This case would only work if your students covered the information in the objectives, right? So if I personally don't know this information, this would be very difficult to do the case. So when we think about the active learning piece, right, if they read a textbook chapter that covered those concepts and you wanted them to be able to think about, did they really digest them? Could they use them in a scenario, right? It's also great test prep, right? Things might become fair game because you're asking them to apply what they learned either in your lecture or from a reading, right? So that might be a way to push here's the sharing of the concepts into the homework or the pre-class assignment and then apply this. So we were also talking on the side about you might decide this is too many questions or it doesn't match what you want to do. You might decide you actually only want to keep the case portion and write your own questions. You can do that, right? There was a question about how would you keep students potentially from just running through all of them or splitting them up. So I have a great document I want to hand out because we won't get to every potential reason. So you can take one. And so Harvard basically wrote, right, I've mentioned this already, possible challenges and possible solutions for you to already think through. But there are a couple ways for you to think about scaffolding case studies to prevent against that. One thing that I like to do, if it's especially going to be a longer classroom activity, more than a couple minutes, is actually only give the questions one at a time. So I actually would not give them the printout like this. So often, if I use a case study, I might only give them the case information and I roll it out in steps. So even though I end up using the same information they might have already printed, I'm in charge of how I roll it out in my classroom so that we spend 5 minutes on the first question, and then maybe we move to a different question, or maybe I write my own question, I was mentioning, I really like having students draw their answers. I haven't found a lot of case studies that let you do that, right? But you might think about asking them to draw something. I bring a lot of handheld whiteboards to class, so that might be something that we're going to do is instead of actually having to, write the answer, maybe we're going to draw our answer to this. So you can modify these questions, especially if they don't exactly match what your class is covering, but the case is what makes it a case study as opposed to just being discussion. So this is a really short one, so there's all different ranges of ways to do this. This one just gave you that document about saying, well, these are the concepts it matches with. So that's the kind of prep work you would have to do as an instructor if you're using somebody else's case study to know that your class actually has the knowledge they could apply. So sometimes it's not as simple as going, well, I'm just going to leave and go do one of these in my class. So you need to make sure that if you're using somebody else's, it's matched to the course content for your course, right? So a lot of the places to find case studies will give you this kind of document that's really only for teachers for you to work through whether or not it's going to fit with not just your class structure, but the actual material that your class is covering, right? Because if it's not, maybe you modify it or maybe you decide to write your own. As you're reading this, you might have really thought to yourself, well, I basically already do this. I just don't write it up in this way, right? Or maybe you're halfway there to having this, but you don't tend to print it up in this way for students. Yep.
So I spent a lot of time recently doing medical simulations, and I guess one of the questions I have about this, tell me if this is not where you want it to go, but is that we typically would not give the diagnosis in the process of determining the diagnosis. So I found myself saying, okay, we have a diagnosis, and now I have to, now I have to give back what I might have read in the reading material.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little confused in terms of that, how the case study would either present a conclusion versus draw the conclusion from the study of the case.
Yep, so there's different frameworks for cases, and I'm going to show us using the Buffalo example where this came from. They basically have a dozen ways to make a case study. They've written them up in terms of explaining what they are. So you might not want a particular type of case studies. You might say, I don't actually want them to have the answer. I want their process to be figuring out the diagnosis. There are a lot of different kinds of case study. So you might write one that is only built in a particular way, or you might want to only be able to search through illustrative case studies. So Buffalo, for example, has clickers. You might say, I teach a really large lecture section. I want to do a case study where we're working through a case, but they're all answering individually using a clicker. They actually have a whole section of clicker case studies. So it's not all necessarily circling up with your neighbor if that's not the format that your class works in. So there's a lot of options that are out there for thinking about it. So I can quickly show you that. Those also become your options for writing. So for example, if you wanted to publish one, and you can, in Buffalo Center, they are peer reviewed, you would have to say what kind of case study you're submitting to them, because they bin them basically into these 12 different types and then make them searchable for other faculty. So other faculty would want to know what kind of case we're exploring together. So I think this is really handy because it has things in here like, how can I prevent one student from dominating the whole conversation? And one of the reasons to use cases and have people play particular roles or have them vote in particular ways, right, like by being the God Squad, is that often everyone's role is required to complete the activity, so it can help scaffold against one person doing all the work in the group and one person not doing any of the work, right? But our goal is often still to create these low-stakes situations for students to practice applying their knowledge. So you might decide that these really involved ones that involve acting out might not be for you. So it's really up to you to think of. So I think this is a great resource, though. So when we shift to thinking about, you might actually have an idea that is a case study. So I realized after teaching conservation bio for several years that I had a lesson that is in practice a draft case study. We talk about the use of lethal collections and basically how can death be in service of conserving life. And we walk through the whole class by using an example of one particular bird species. And I was like, this is a case study. We're all doing this, but this is a case study, right? So I'm working with some other people and we're actually trying to write it up now formally to publish it. But we're actually doing that as a research case study. It can also be for teaching, and we're going to publish it in a place that does it for both. But you might have ideas, especially if you've taught a class multiple times and have developed content, you might realize it actually is a case study, or I'm on my way to having a case study, right? You don't have to share it with other people, but if you already have one, publishing it might be something you want to do so you can get feedback from your peers and also get credit for it, right? A lot of us share our teaching material with other people, but this is a way, right, that if you're the person who authored this, it's your byline on here. So this is the idea in part behind open educational materials, but you're still getting credit for sharing the lesson plans that you developed, right, as a teacher scholar. So what are the elements that you want to have? So this is another great handout that I'll share that's from Harvard's Business School. They're really the people leading this. So I gave us some great resources because we don't have our own in-house repository at this point, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel because there's a lot of great information out there. So this is the hard copy, but these exist online, so I can make sure we also send out the links for other people. But these are the characteristics of what you might want to think about if you were going to write your own or thinking through how to adapt one in class, right? So what are the outcomes that you want for your students? What are the preconditions, right? So everybody has to come prepared for this to work, right? So there might be some things that you need to think about in terms of how do we need to set this up for this to go well for everybody, right? So if you set it up where they need to do the reading ahead of time in order to do the case study in class, you might have to think about how that's going to work for your class. Or do you want to give them the background reading in the class or cover lecture material the first half, and then they apply the knowledge of that in the second half, right? There's a lot of different ways to think about this. So this is a great one-pager to think about the important elements to doing this effectively in class. There's one that I really like for us as teachers, which this one is specifically a one-pager about prepping for leading a case study in your own classroom. In order for this to go smoothly and go in the time period that you want it to, it's not just the students who have to be prepared, right? We need to be prepared as faculty. So especially if you're going to write your own, it needs to be really well matched to the content that we're giving them. So if they're supposed to be applying a theory, the activity needs to be really well matched to the knowledge that we've either given them or cumulative, right? So are they applying knowledge from the whole semester to date, for example? So this is a great worksheet for us to think about how to do this in our classroom for either using and adapting other people's or for doing your own that you want to create in the first place, right? So what's the structure of your class? What's the opening for people being able to make comments and ask questions? And then think about what you want students to get out of it, and how do you plan to close this activity, right? So think about the one that we just did. If I was going to use it in a classroom, how would I want to wrap this back up? Do I want students to report out on that? Do I want them to have notes for themselves and it becomes testable material later on? There's no one way to do this, so these are all decision points for you as an instructor. So that's the reason I like this for us as faculty to think about, is it's not just one size fits all, but it also means there's a lot of decision points for all of us to think about when it comes to using them in our classroom. So that strength of flexibility also becomes, it doesn't mean it's less work for us to actually prep and do, because there's a lot more to actually having it work as a case study in your classroom. All right, so if you're writing one though for yourself, so I'll show you some places where you can find them, but if you're saying, well, we have a really specific topic in our class and I have some ideas, I'd like to create one of them. Here's things to think about in terms of making sure that it's really going to work in a formal case study format. So real events can often be really exciting for students to think about. So there is an example of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge takeover. There was an armed takeover of a birding refuge a couple years ago, right? It was a real world event. There were a lot of really controversial issues, and so often things that are thought-provoking or there's an element of conflict, especially if it's a real world event, then you don't have to imagine all the hypothetical backstory. You can actually pull from news sources, right? You can think about, in terms of writing your own, you can write about real world events in a way that makes it a case study for your class. Thinking about which kinds of real world events let them apply either knowledge or theory that they're learning in your class, right? So you want those things to be well matched, or else they will be unhappy with your activity, right? They'll feel like it's not fair. So thinking about how to match those things up well really depends on what you want to use it for. And then the whole point of these is that people are making decisions. So this often also applies even if you're using another one. You want to make sure if I write the backstory of the God Squad, right? The whole point is that the activity is about them voting on something with their knowledge. They don't just have a conversation. They have to make a decision as a team in that case. So decision making and agency of the people who are in the case study is part of it. That's again one of the things that makes it not just an example and not just we're going to have a class discussion, but there's some sort of decision point that's happening either as an individual or as their team. So some of the best ones, right, it's not just a real world issue, it's thinking about what makes it really thought provoking. Is it something that's a controversy, right? This works really well, for example, in ethics. We don't just want to tell our students about ethical challenges. Once they have to actually make a decision in a hypothetical scenario or thinking on a real world scenario, they might realize how complicated it is to really be the people making those decisions, right? This can really promote empathy with other people. So even though it's in a fictitious setting, it can give them a better understanding of what it might be like for those other practitioners in the real world. And those might be people that they have to work with, even if they're not training to become those people, right? So I used to teach at UW-Madison, and that environmental science major, those students actually had to take a hunting class. And the idea was that they didn't want those students to become state agency decision makers without understanding what it was like to be a hunter if you were going to regulate them. So again, if I'm in my windowless basement lecture hall, how am I going to give students that experience? So maybe by giving them a really detailed backstory and this kind of activity, we can bring some of that real world to them, right? That's the motivation. Again, it has to do with that moment of decision, but especially if you're going to write your own, you want to think about what amount of information do I need to give them to make that decision. You don't always have to craft it yourself. So for example, when we do this with endangered species, I don't write the whole backstory. There's an ESA profile of all those animals, but I need to make sure that I'm either digesting it for the students to use in an hour, or I'm giving them graphs and figures. So once you start going through different collections of them, you might notice there's actually tables from papers in there. There's different kinds of information because you need to give them sufficient data to actually embody somebody's decision-making process. So that's not just saying this person is a hunter. What does that mean if your student has never actually been in that situation? What kinds of information do they need about the backstory? And so often, especially if you pick a real-world example, you don't have to imagine all of those yourself. You can go and easily retrieve that information. So we'll send these as links, but there are databases basically that can either be topic specific or they're journals of case studies. So these are often the same places to publish them. So that's why I'll talk about them together. So some of them are really just, these are all 3 journals, for example. Oop, I forgot, this is clinical case studies. So the International Journal of Teaching and Case Studies is a journal that you can go to and search for your content area. So is the Buffalo database that I can show you, right? There's one that's entirely case study. This is an Elsevier published, right? Comes out multiple times a year. So you can publish there, but you can also go there to retrieve case studies to use in your class. Some of them are topical. I am most familiar with all the ones having to do with environment because those are what I teach about, right? So this one is centered on teaching about environment, but I did look around and there are all kinds of them, right? I really did find one that was entirely about electrical engineering. So if that's what you teach, the case studies are out there. So it might take a little bit of work to figure out if there is a topical database for your area of work, or you might need to look in terms of these broader ones that publish all kinds of case studies to figure out either where you want to find them or where you'd like to place one if you write your own. So there was a question before about thinking about, there are teaching case studies, so you might write or be using ones that are specifically written for other faculty, or you might be interested in doing case study research that's for publication as that qualitative method, right? One case study can actually serve as both in practice. So I was giving an example of these first-year students I'm working with, none of whom are majors in the field, and they're all actually really liking this as our approach to doing a research project because number one, they're doing it in groups, they're not alone, so they're working on a case together. But cases are really, really focused, right? So often if we give a research project to students, especially if they're not already, let's say, in a graduate program, it's not their area of specific expertise, a case makes something really digestible. So you can think about creating these not just for yourself as a faculty member, as a teacher, but think about whether or not that would fit for the kinds of training that you're giving your students, right? So I've done this in multiple classes now at all different levels. So now we have first year students doing it, but I had master's students do it in a co-enrolled class last year, but then they actually classroom tested their case study on a class of undergraduates, right? Then they revised their case study based on how it went teaching it. And so for our master's students, it was a great way to do digestible, bite-sized research that they can actually do in a short enough time frame to publish while they're still in their master's program, which is not true for their master's thesis, right? They're going to finish that and graduate, and they're still working on getting that out there. So it's a real opportunity, if it works for some of those goals in your class, to not just teach them yourself, but actually create them either with students or ask students to create them for other people. So I'm happy if people want to see that directly, you can follow up with me and see the draft. The students are still working on it, right? But that goes through peer review for them. It's a great experience for them to go through that process, especially for our graduate students if they're interested in going on to a PhD program. And then we have a lot of grad programs here at RIT that are co-enrolled, so your master's students might already be working with undergrads, and that becomes their colleagues to pilot their case study on, right, and get feedback from people. In my classes, we always peer review each other's work. So the students this semester who are our first year students, they're all going to peer review each other's case study. The reason I like this journal, and it's newer, is that they have a template for submitters, a great template. So they say, you want to send us a case study? It needs to be in this format and this many words. They also have a reviewer template. So it means that when our students create them and they want to know if they're likely to be able to get it in there, right, they can look at the reviewer template for the peer reviewers. Lots of other journals that do case studies do not have very clear guidelines. So I'm going to show you the Buffalo site really quickly. They do not give you a template. Ooh. So this is the National Center for Case Study Teaching in Science. This is at SUNY Buffalo. So this is where the one we just did came from. There are hundreds of them in here. They're all different topics. They're not always at the level of college, so one thing to think about if you want to use them for class is to make sure you're using these searching settings. But Owen's question was about this type method. So I just wanted to show you that they have different types. So one is analyzing issues. Some of them are a dilemma. So all of these are set up as a dilemma that people need to work through and solve. A jigsaw, some of you might have heard of this in terms of another active learning strategy where different people have different pieces of information in order to complete the activity. Everyone needs the information that the other group members have. So the idea is that they have to work together because everyone only has the information from people in their role. And then the group together has to answer a question with everybody's knowledge. So these are all different ways to set them up. But if you're interested in only using a particular kind of way of applying their knowledge, you can search through these different types. Do you have a question?
Are any of those types non-teaching cases?
This is all teaching in science. So there are other collections that are not specific to teaching. So I can pull up quickly. The one that I just have looked at a lot is CS. So Case Studies on the Environment is a University of California academic press that publishes all qualitative research case studies. So in practice, there are teaching notes for some of these, and you can teach with them. Some people even give you, like, here's my PowerPoint slides, here's how I teach it in class, but they are research-based also. So some of it depends on which repository you're looking at. So yes, if you're interested in submitting research-based ones, you would not want to go to Buffalo to submit yours because you're not interested in having high school teachers teach your case study. So this is a combination of both. But so I like this idea of having the type method because it's really important, especially if you're searching through other people's, to make sure that it lets them apply their knowledge in the way that you want them to. So for example, case studies in the environment, if I hover over read, it has different topic areas. So if I was teaching an environmental law class, I might say, well, I'm only interested in looking at the policy and law ones, right? I teach environmental policy here, maybe I only want to teach the ones here. But it doesn't have a way for you to search through what kind of case you're looking at, right? So there's not one repository for case studies, so a lot of that varies on where you're getting them from. That's a lot of information. There's two more handouts I think would be great for us thinking about how we might think through this. This one is from a book that's actually written for students about case studies. So basically Harvard had to publish a book that explained to students why they were using case studies as the basis of their education. So we have access to the book, and this is just the first 4 pages. So we'll also post a link, but the idea is this is how you explain to students what we're doing with case studies and why we're using them. So I personally have on my syllabus a section about case studies and active learning and that why we're using them this semester and what we get out of them. So I sort of front load that information to explain what it is at the beginning of the semester. But this is one conversational way in a short book chapter to think about that. This is one more handout that's 1 page for teachers about thinking about how you might apply it in your class. So these are the sorts of things to just walk away from thinking, how could I think through for my class how this might work for me, or how I want to write one to develop for my class.
We'll have digital copies of all of these.
Yes, I can make sure you have all the links, yep. The nice thing about these though too, right, so it's not the links, but if you want to scribble on this would be the kind of thing where if I was thinking, how would I do this in my class? I might actually write on this in hard copy and try to answer these questions for myself, right? Like, what do I want them to get out of this class, right? What is it that this might work for? So the 3 handouts that are 1-pagers from Harvard that are for faculty to think about how you might want to do this in your class. So that's why I like them. Combined especially with the sort of problem solving ahead of actually even teaching it. So thinking through this handout in terms of, especially if it's new to you, as a way to structure your group learning in class, how you might do this. Any other questions?
I catch you afterwards. Is it more interested also in how you use your classes to create research pieces?
Yes.
So I just wanted to say we reached the end of the official session, but Kaitlin has kindly agreed to hang out for questions. So if you need to go, feel free to do so. And thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.